Now, this is the way the Lord speaks to me. I will be in bed asleep, or I'll be driving a car, or I'll be sitting in the office, or I'll be just walking around doing something, be riding on the tractor. I can be anywhere, and God speaks to me. He speaks to me often with one word, a word that I don't know the definition of, or that I'm not so familiar with. And this week, the Lord spoke to me, and he said, conundrum. And so it's an important word. Here's what it means. It means something that's hard to explain, something that's hard to understand. It's a puzzle. It's a riddle. Often, it is answered with a pun or with something that is just a little different kind of humor. God spoke to me and he said, America is becoming a conundrum to the rest of the watching world. It's a puzzle. It's a riddle. It's a mystery. It's something that's hard to understand, especially when you think about how much it costs this nation to become what it is, what it has been. It's a very difficult thing for us to stop and think. We're willing to throw everything away, everything that it's cost this nation. All the blood of young men and women, their futures, their dreams, their relationships, that we're willing to throw all of those things away, then it is a conundrum in the mind of the watching world. French businessmen recently told one politician, and now a television, program man, one of the talking heads on television, told him, said, why in the world is America following the path of socialism? Said, don't they realize that we've already tried that and it's failed? And so we do not understand completely what's going on in America today, but the church had better wake up. Now, this nation is God's idea. This nation was God's idea. And this nation is going to continue to be God's idea. Okay, who is Paul Revere? Well, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote an incredible poem. I mean, it's a long poem. It says, now listen, my children, and you shall hear the midnight ride of Paul Revere. And it goes on, it says, if the British march by land or sea from the town tonight, hang the lantern aloft in the belfry arch of the North Church, ever as a signal light. What happened? This took place on April the 18th, 1775, and Paul Revere started out on a ride where he went from town to town and farm to farm and village to village, screaming, the British are coming, the British are coming. He woke them up in the middle of the night, and he rode from Boston, Massachusetts to Concord, Massachusetts in this ride that's infamous today because he did this without fear of the British. Now, what was happening? A month before, in the streets of Boston, there was a squad of British soldiers who were imposing taxation. And what took place at that time was that the people were angered at them, and they began to snowball these British soldiers. Now, snowball is no weapon against a British musket. And they took their long rifles and they shot into the crowd, and many were wounded, and 3 were laid dying in the streets of Boston. Anybody here know what they call that? They call it the Boston Massacre. And the reason they call it the Boston Massacre is because that's where the first man fell in the Revolution, the battle for the independence of this nation. What's going to surprise some of you is this man was a very unique man. He was a man that they think had been a slave that had fled from slavery to Boston. He was a very vocal man, and he was standing against those soldiers, and he was speaking out against them. Now, Paul Revere was not a very good artist, but he was an illustrator. He was a silversmith. And so he drew a picture of the Boston Massacre. It was just an illustration. They had the soldiers lined up with their muskets, and their feet were all in a row like a firing squad. Some of you remember this picture. It said far more than it said. In the background, there is a church that stands there, down at the end of the street. It sent a message. Number one, they were fighting without fear for the freedom of speech. And the church standing in the distance said, we're fighting without fear for the freedom of religion. Because if they can stop the freedom of speech, then they will be able to stop the freedom of religion. They'll be able to put a coffin nail in it right from the very beginning. It also is a reminder that freedom did not come at a cheap price, but it was very costly. How many of you know the name John Puford? Not a one of you. Well, he was a better artist than Paul Revere was. And John Puford depicted this same scene. In the picture of John Puford, there are British soldiers that are standing in the street of Boston, and they have their rifles with their bayonets pointed at those innocent people that were throwing snowballs. How many of you know what's in the middle of that picture? Anybody know? There is a soldier with his rifle and bayonet stuck in the neck of a black man. The first man to die in the revolution was a black man. I began to think about that, and I thought, you know, this nation is a great nation. But it's changing right before our face. It's kind of like this coffee mug, or any coffee mug that you might have at home that has ballpoint pens in it. That's a nice container. It may be a good place for these pens and pencils. You can remember where it is. But I'm going to tell you right now, that's not what that coffee mug was made for. How many of you are with me? That's not what this nation was made for. For us just discard the pens and the pencils of those that wrote the history for the day in which we live and the freedoms that we enjoy. You know what's wrong with this? It's a conundrum. It's a riddle. It's a mystery. It's a puzzle. It's something hard to explain. And that's exactly where America right now is. But in the picture depicted by Paul Revere, the church stands at a distance as though it's not really involved in the fight at that moment. I'm telling you, the church is standing at a distance in this hour, and it's time for you to roll up your sleeves and say, look, I am American. This nation is not the nation that God intends for it to be, because Christians are not what they intend for them to be. Now, the Bible is a one-book book. And God is the God of the book. And whether we like it or not, since it's a one-book book, the judgments that came on people in the Old Testament can come upon people in what we call the dispensation of grace, trying to make it a two-book book. But at the same time, we have to understand that God that is the God of this book is also the miracle working God. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He is the one that shows up in the fiery furnace, the lion's den, and guides the children of Israel across the Red Sea. It's a one book, and He is God of the book.